Are you working with lots of data in Excel? Whether it's sales data, budgets, performance metrics, sometimes you just need quick answers without writing a single formula. Well, that's where pivot tables come in. In this short video, I'll show you how to build, customize, and supercharge your pivot tables, plus some power user tips that you wish you knew sooner. I'm going to start by clicking within the table of data that I've already set up here on the Insert tab, Pivot Table. So at the top here, select the table or range. So you can see this is my table name, or it could be a range of cells, but I recommend using tables for this so that as your table grows or shrinks, then the pivot table will automatically pick up the right values. And then you can choose where you want to place it. For this one, I'm going to put existing worksheet. Okay, so if we want to summarize this by the products sold, we put the products into our rows. So these are going to be rows. Then I'm going to put quantity within the value field and unit price within the value field. Okay, so here we've got a quick visualization that for these products, we sold this many quantities and at these unit prices. We've just summarized this table of data with a few clicks. So within a pivot table, your column, what you drop into your columns area goes across the columns, what you drop into the rows area goes down your rows. Pivot filters are at the top, so if I was to drop the region into here, this adds us a filter, and we can then choose of the 4 different regions we have here to see data specifically for that region. Within the values field, at the moment you can see these have defaulted to sum of. We can click into these value field settings and we can choose from this list of inbuilt functions. For example, if we went to count, we'd see how many orders. I'm going to leave these on sum of for this particular example. At the top here you can see we can give the pivot table a name. I'm just going to call this one PT Sales. If we ever want to find this pivot table now, we can use the view navigation and you can see we've got our pivot table for sales, and if we click there it'll highlight. I'm just going to move this pivot table so it comes down off my first row here. You can go into pivot table analyze, move pivot table, okay. You can see that's come down out in my header region now. We can change the formatting of how this pivot table looks. We just need to click anywhere within the pivot table. You can see the pivot table ribbon appears. We're going to click on design, and then I'm going to click this drop down. And these are all the inbuilt designs we can use. I'm going to go for this one. You can further amend whether you want headers to be colored, whether you want rows to have banding. I'm going to leave rows and column banding on so we have some lines. And you can amend the column headers here. You can add in subtotals for certain groups by using this function. You can show them at the top, the bottom, or not at all. And we can add in grand totals as well. If I was to drag the region down into the rows, you can see this is a compact view. I prefer to use, if we go to report layout, we're on compact. I prefer to use tabular form so that we have a separate column for each of these row items. You'll notice that east doesn't have any further labels, same with north. You can go back into report layout, repeat all labels. If for example we didn't want subtotals on each of the regions, we can right click on here, turn off subtotals. Don't worry, you can avoid having to set these same settings up over and over again every time you create a pivot table. If you've got a preferred layout, then save that as your default layout. That's definitely going to save you time in the long run. Let's look at how to do it. So if we go to File, Options, Data, Edit Default Layout, you can quickly import a selection if you've already set it up in the current workbook. So I'm just going to click on here, Import. This is going to give me all the options that we've already done in here. I'm just going to turn off subtotals. I don't want them in all my default pivot tables. You can see I've got grand totals off for rows and columns, and I want it to show in tabular format. We want all item labels to be repeated. And in the pivot table options, I'm going to turn off auto column widths so that the columns don't automatically change in width to suit the data size every time we refresh. And I'm also going to go to the data tab and I'm going to make sure that number of items to retain per field is none. Click OK. So now if we test that out, I'm going to click into our table. We're going to insert another quick pivot, pivot table, existing worksheet. OK. We're going to drop in our region, our product, and our quantity and our unit price. And you can see it's inserted no subtotals, it's given us no grand totals, It's not showed these in compact form. If I just make these fields narrow, if we go to refresh, you can see they're not changing in width. So it's retained all our settings, one-time setup, and that will be in all our pivot tables now. If our data set changes over time that the pivot table's linked to, we don't want to retain any history because it's confusing when filtering the pivot table. I'm just going to remove product A here. So now we have no product A within our source data. However, if I refresh the pivot table and click on the filter, you can see widget A still appears. The reason for this is it retains history. To disable that, right click on the pivot table options, data, number of items to retain, none. Okay. So now if we refresh the pivot again, click on our filter, widget A is now gone. You don't need all your data that you want to display in your pivot table to be existing in your source data. And what I mean by that is if we look at this, we've got quantity and unit prices. What we might need is total price. So that would be the sum of our quantity times our unit price. So we've got both of those as columns within our source data. What you might see a lot of people doing is either they'll add another column into their source data. So they do 25 times 6 so that you've got the total price in there. So that's going to add a lot of data into our source table. I'm just going to undo that. Well, what I see a lot of is people set up a pivot table and then to the right hand side of the pivot table they have further calculations. For example, this times that. And then they'll repeat that down. Someone will refresh the pivot table. They've not set their formulas up to be dynamic and suddenly you've got a pivot table that's a different size to calculations to the right hand side. What we're going to do is we're going to add this as a calculated column into our pivot table. So if we click into our pivot table and go up to Pivot Table Analyze, we're going to go to Fields, Items and Sets, and we're going to add in a calculated field. We're going to call this Total Price, and our formula is going to be quantity times unit price. And if we click Add, you can see that's dropped a new field called Total Price. If we click OK, and you can see that's instantly added itself into the pivot table as a field. So now we've got that sum that somebody might have previously manually added into the source data or manually added to the right hand side of the pivot, built straight into the pivot table. If you need to amend that calculated field, you can click back into your pivot table, up into Fields and Sets, Calculated, and then if you use the drop down, you can see all the calculated fields that you've previously created. We can click onto Total Price and we can amend the formula if need be. An alternative to a calculated field is a calculated item. So in the previous example where we had two separate columns that we wanted to do a sum of, in this example we've just got one amount column but we've got two different scenarios within a column. So we've got our actuals and our budget. Let's see how we can do actuals versus budget. So I'm just going to click Insert Pivot Table. I'm going to pop this to the right hand side here. We're going to put our departments in our rows. We're going to put our types in our columns, and then we're going to put our amounts in our values. So you can see now we have actuals by department and budget by department. What we want to see is a comparison between the two. Again, what you might see people doing is creating manual columns over to the right hand side with formulas. We don't want to do that. Let's build it straight into the pivot table. So if we click anywhere in the pivot table again, Pivot Table Analyze, Fields, Items and Sets. You can see at the moment I'm not seeing calculated item. Just make sure you clicked up in the header row on the item you want to calculate from, and you can see now that calculated item is available. I'm going to click into that. I'm going to call this column Variance, and in our formula you can see instead of just having access to the fields, we now actually have access to the items within those fields. So within our type column we want to do actual minus budget. If we click OK, you can see that's now automatically added in a variance column of our budget against actuals, even though the one amount column was a single column within our original data source. No need for formulas, no need for adding to the original source data. Build them straight into your pivot tables. To add a nice visual to the pivot table, instead of the user using these inbuilt filters, what you can use is an actual slicer. So if we go to Insert slicer, and then we're going to have a slicer on the product. Okay, so this will bring you up a window like this. You can customize the slicer. You can see whenever we clicked on the slicer ribbon appears. Again, similar to the pivot table, we can choose inbuilt formats. I'm going to go for green. You can control the width, the height, and how many buttons show in each of the columns. So for example, if we wanted these buttons to be split across 4 columns, we could go like so. We could control the width of the box or the height by dragging, or we can type in numbers up here to get it exactly how we want. So say we want 11 centimeters by 7 centimeters. This slicer can then be clicked by the user as a quick visual on controlling the linked pivot tables. Slicers can be really useful if you're linking pivot tables to set up a dashboard view of multiple pivot tables, because these slicers can be linked to more than one pivot table. I'm just going to duplicate this pivot table and we're going to set it up by product. So now when we click this slicer, you'll see the slicer is applying to both pivot tables that it's linked to. And we can test that by clicking on the slicer into our slicer ribbon and report connections. And you can see at the moment this is linked to our 2 pivot tables. If I was to untick this, click OK, remove this filter from here. Now as we cycle through these, you can see this pivot table's unaffected. If we go back into the slicer, report connections, turn back on pivot table 6, and suddenly the slicer controls both. If your pivot table contains dates, then another useful visual is to have a timeline. So if we click on the pivot table and then we go to insert timeline, you can see it's recognized the date column. Click OK. Now we have a timeline, which again appears in the ribbon up here. You can customize how it looks. You can amend the height, the width, and what connections it's got, similar to a slicer. And then you can see if we go over to January, we could click January, February, and it's a quick visual way of limiting to specific months or dates. At the moment this is defaulted to months. If we clicked up here, we could do years, quarter, months, days. When working with days in a pivot table, we drop in this date into our product rows. You can see it's added this custom grouping of January and February by month. We can use these expand buttons to expand out that group, or we can right click within a column and we can click expand and collapse entire field. So if you've got lots of collapse fields, expand entire field is a quick way. If you don't like this auto grouping of days and months, you can just drag the month field that it's added in here out and the days field, and you can see we're just left with the date that we originally added in. The great thing about pivot tables is once you've set them up and you add into your data, you can just quickly refresh them to recognize the new data that's been added. At the bottom of this, I'm just going to add in some more data for widget A. So we've got 81 quantity for widget A. If I right click on the pivot table and click refresh, you can see that's automatically updated to be 105 to include the new data. If for any reason you need to change where your pivot table is looking at for its source data, you can go to pivot table analyze, change source data. You can also refresh from the pivot table ribbon here. Field list is getting in your way, taking up valuable screen space on the right hand side. You can close it. However, you might notice when you click back in the pivot table, the field list no longer shows. You can right click on your pivot table, show field list, or alternatively, at the top, pivot table analyze, click your field list button, and it comes back. When you're working with big data sets with lots of data in, sometimes the default pivot table fields list setup is not particularly useful. You might have hundreds of columns up here. There'll be lots of scrolling trying to find the right column that you're trying to add. So I recommend changing to side-by-side view. This way you've got more screen estate to see your pivot table available columns. Whenever referring to cells within a pivot table, the default behavior is to get pivot data. This can be really useful. However, if you just want a traditional cell reference, you can turn this behavior off. If you click in your pivot table, analyze, options, untick generate get pivot data. This time when we refer to a cell, you can see you just get the cell reference. Well, that's it. In 15 minutes, you've just learned how to build and customize pivot tables, add formatting, refreshing for dynamic ranges, insert calculated fields and items, add slices and timelines for visuals. I hope you found that really useful. Please hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week for more Excel power tricks.